The ACN podcast is made possible thanks to the generosity of our listeners and sponsors, including the Agile Alliance. As a nonprofit membership organization, the Agile Alliance is an excellent resource to help you along your Agile journey. To learn more about the Agile Alliance and our other sponsors, as well as how you can become a sponsor or supporter of our show, please visit acnpodcast.org for more information. And thank you for your support. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Network. My name is Ray Arell. I'm joined every month by a set of outstanding co-hosts that includes Shauna, Diana, Jorg, Sheila Eckhart, Sheila McGrath, and Hendrik. Unfortunately, Shauna, Diana, Jorg, and Hendrik are not going to be able to attend today, but we're still going to have a great conversation. And the way that this particular show works is that everyone who joined our live recording event has added their voice to this podcast. This is episode 91. And in those 91 episodes, we have included people who've had oodles of experience in Agile, who've been doing it for decades. And then we've also had people who are brand new to Agile. And what we find is that the perspective on both sides are very valuable to the conversation. Meaning if you're just getting started with Agile, you are discovering things or you're coming across things that you can see as unique or things that you might give a contrast to that those of us who've been doing it a while, we might have a different perspective on all of this. So just keep that in mind. If you are new to the Agile world, we still want to hear from you. The ACN is supported by listeners as an organization. New Agility is the social enterprise who produces the show that's looking at how do we go improve people and companies to work in a new way of work. And part of that, the ACN has been at the core of the starting point. This is our 7th year anniversary, which is pretty cool to see an organization get 7 years through. And a lot of that happens to come from the support that we get from the listeners, as well as we get from our sponsors. I do want to make a special shout out to one of our sponsors, which is the Agile Alliance. They are the title sponsor for the show. Any of you are currently a member of the Agile Alliance, you probably saw a note come from one of the, I believe it was the board chair, who sent out a message that was talking about some financial insecurities that the organization is undergoing at this particular point. The Agile Alliance, if you're not familiar with who they are, the ones who started the Agile revolution way back when. The original manifesto was those 12 people who sat in a room and created it. This logo was on the first publication of that. The Agile Alliance has been in existence since the start of Agile. They've been primarily doing, of course, the big conferences that they do every year, the big sort of jamboree of Agilists who come together every year. But they also, throughout the year, do a number of different things, including sponsor this show, as well as a number of different monthly events that they do. It's fairly inexpensive to join the Agile Alliance. It's probably one of the cheapest things that you can do is to go invest in them. And that in turn helps to go invest back into the Agile community. That's how they support their initiatives, and that support that you give them is incredibly important. So please give them a look. Go over to agilealliance.org. If you are currently a member, renew it. And if you currently are wanting to support their mission, they are a nonprofit organization, please go ahead and click and give them some help. That would be great. Again, if this is your first time, we already talked about the perspectives that we want to get from everyone. Let's amplify the key learnings that we have and let's have some fun. Simplicity has been a part of the Agile Manifesto. It's a part of the 12 principles. It's been there for a long time. And I find myself, every time that I go in and coach a team, this particular principle is probably the most misunderstood of all of the 12. There's a couple of contenders that are up for the next one in the level, but simplicity, the art of maximizing the amount of work not done, is essential to the way that we approach work with an Agile team. As an example, there's an old report that was published called the Standish Report that looked and said, of the key features within Microsoft Office, what's the percentage of them that are rarely used or never used? And I might get the statistics slightly wrong because it's been a while since I looked at it, but pretty much what it said is about 60% of the features that were put into that product are never used by a customer. such a waste. And really, if you think about the amount of dollars and money that we spend and putting in a feature, because people don't want to do a bad job. They want to go put in the best feature that they can, that having something that just isn't picked up and used really is just waste. And I'm also both agile and a lean person. My lean blood starts to boil a little bit when we figure out that there's something in there that the customer doesn't want. And we spend several $100,000 to maybe a couple $1,000,000 to go implement that feature, which is not good. It's not easy to embrace simplicity, even just the discussion of whether or not a feature should be in or not should be in. It's a discussion that sometimes teams gloss over very quickly. And if you look at the product owner structure that we have in most organizations, the product owner has spoken, therefore we're going to go put it in. But what I find a challenge is that the team members don't push back sometimes and say, what did the customer want? What was the customer conversation? What was it about? Why was this design decision taken this particular direction? Why are we making this more complex than we should? There's a lot of team interaction that takes place to make a better and more simplistic design. And I think that's one aspect of this, which I think as we get into the questions that we're going to ask, what are the ways that people go off and approach making something more simplistic within their organization? One of them is, and I teach this all the time, and I see this sometimes being done really well in companies and other times not done well at all or not at all. And that is looking at minimum viable product. Don't push everything into a product just because you want to have a checkmark box, even because you're trying to compete with a competitor. If the feature isn't used by your customer, let the competitor waste the money. Let them go ahead and put a feature in that nobody really wants. Don't do it. Don't follow that if you think that is something that truly your customer doesn't want. So MVP practices, automation of things that are just repetitive within your organization is another way that I see to make your work environment more simplistic. Regular refactoring work, which is technical debt within your code or in your any product, whether it be code or whether it be anything. That as you carry that forward, that just makes more work for your organization. And I could tell you that as code rots, and code does rot over time, that really is something that if you don't take those steps, you end up having to do a lot of extra work that is really not important. And really it just becomes something to where you spend 90% of your time trying to maintain existing code bases and very little time put onto new feature development. The bottom one here, which is talking about just fostering a culture, meaning that it comes out of everyone's mouth about how do we take simpler choices in the way that we approach things. Very much it becomes a part of the culture within the organization. You can see those decisions being made so often that simplicity in the way that work is approached within the organization, you could tell it's a cultural component. Or in the opposite, complexity, making things too complex, seems to also be a cultural component that becomes a part of those businesses as well. So the questions to kick everything off today is, as a coach, how do you help teams understand this agile value? How do you get to the point where they look at and say, I understand this principle, and as a rule of thumb, I'm following that? What are the key challenges that you face as you're trying to help teams through this? And those key challenges, again, how do you address them? And then lastly, what are other ways that I've mentioned a few ideas of how to maximize simplicity within the organization? How do you maximize the amount of work done in your organizations? So to kick us off, Sheila McGrath, do you want to take a first stab at this?
When you talk about simplicity, I think that the development teams often get confused, and their management especially gets confused about what we're trying to make simple. It isn't that we're trying to make it simple for the developers to do their work, which is a one-time task. What we're trying to make it simple is to make the business processes simple that people are going to have to follow. And when you talk about, I'm very much in favor of minimum viable product. because a lot of times what people envision isn't necessarily what they actually need. Most people envision things based on what they currently have. And probably the reason they're making changes is because what they have isn't adequate. But they're not going back to a blank canvas. They're working within a framework of we've already got this stuff in place and we've got to keep it, when that's not necessarily true.
Along that line, I have helped teams defeature something before, meaning take that feature out because we're going to be maintaining it. When I was working in semiconductor, we understood that if we put a feature in, we're maintaining it for 7 years. So you better be darn sure that you do that. So how do you help that team through that decision-making process of defeaturing or descaling something that they might have in their code base?
One thing I've done, which I think it's something that comes out of lean, is get the relevant parties in a room. And instead of letting each group prioritize their own stuff separately, there are ways to weight what's being prioritized so that everybody looks at everything that needs to be done. And you prioritize based on the absolute priority relative to everything else that's meaningful to the business. So it's, what do I need? But it's also, what does the business as a whole need? And I've done things where we did a weighted average and each team was only allowed to present a certain number of things they needed, each business group. And then within those, you pick the highest priority ones that have the most value to the business. The other thing is, if it's something that's not going to be used that often, and it's an exception process, does it need to be a Cadillac with all the bells and whistles, or are they going to be fine the few times that they need to use it with something that's more like a Model T? You have to ask the business about those needs. In one case, I remember that wasn't too long ago, we had an idea of a design for a new process that involved about 4 different departments. And as we started to walk through how it would actually work to document the procedures that they were going to need to do, well, before we'd actually done the development, we were looking at what is the business process going to be, what procedures will they need to put in place, what people will they need to have, will it change their hiring needs, how much resources on an ongoing basis within the business is it going to tie up? And we realized that there was a way we could streamline it where we could cut one of those departments out completely if we changed the process. It was going to be a little more complicated to develop, but it might take a little longer. Actually, it turned out it didn't take as much time as what we'd originally envisioned, but we thought initially it was going to take more. But it still seemed like it was going to be worth it because the business was then the one whole department wasn't going to need to devote resources to it at all because we'd eliminated a step in the process, and it wasn't going to add to the amount of work for the other departments involved. But management panicked because it was a change and we hadn't finished the development. And why hadn't finished the development? But if you're developing the wrong thing, what value is there in continuing with it? But the hardest challenge with that was to make the development team's management understand that this was a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a difficult challenge to go approach because in most cases, as a leader, one of the things that you actually, you fall in love with your product, you fall in love with your ideas. And therefore, when somebody tells you that your baby's ugly, that's hard to take in.
It wasn't even just that. It was that you're reallocating resources within the sprint.
Oh, that sounds like a little bit of micromanagement. But then again, that comes down to maybe a miss of communication. Scott, you have your hand up. What do you have on this?
Yeah, so just listening to everything so far, it's reminding me of some work I'm doing right now with our product owner. I've been talking to him about trying to define MVP and reaching out to our business partners to help with that and to determine what our customer journey is and to also try to bring the business and IT closer to start to open up the dialogue between those two groups to say, look, if we can define an MVP, then we can actually get pieces of this out into production and we can start doing some A/B testing and we can start getting some feedback from our customer, we'll start to figure out what they truly want. And we will also find out where that end line is to where this is good enough. Let's move on to the next thing. Giving our customers more of what they're really going to use and less of what they're not going to use. And I'm finding that having those conversations and trying to bring the business kind of into that IT Agile world, this is one of the topics that I talk about a lot with them to try to pull them in and say, look, we're partners here and we want to we have a finite amount of capacity. We want to use it wisely. We want to give you as much positive outcomes as we can. And the last thing we want to do is start giving you and the customer things they're never going to use.
How does that sit, though, with the marketing departments and others? Do you find that the challenge becomes, again, similar to what Sheila was just talking about, where it's we've convinced ourselves we need this, and then the convincing of that we don't, even though you're stacking up customer data behind it? Do you find that to be a huge challenge within this business?
Yes, all of this is a huge challenge, but the best you can do really is what I try to do is if there's a group or a person, we really need this. Okay, then what are the business scenarios that you can outline for us that will show us this need? And in the times where they can't, then we talk about, can we put that as like an MVP +1 and let us work on MVP here where we know these are needs for our customer and that we are pretty sure that they're going to use this, but we're not even positive about this stuff. But here, you don't really have any business use cases of why anybody would need this. Can we set that off into a phase 2 kind of a thing? And we're not telling you we're not going to do it. We're just telling you we're not going to focus on that right now and then you go through it with them. We're going to focus on A, B, C, and D. And we're going to get that out there. We're going to do some A/B testing on a couple of different flavors of this. We're going to get that data. And then we will, as we move on, we can start talking about whether this is actually useful. And to that extent, if you wind up having to go down that road, it's like we can put out a small little test version of this and do some A/B testing there and find out if there's a population that would actually use this. And then that's real solid data to take back to say, look, we put this out here to 5,000 people and nobody used it. And it's been sitting out there for 3 months. Do you really want us to turn this on for everybody or put all the bells and whistles around this? Or do you want us to move on to an MVP of your next most important thing? Again, finite amount of capacity. How do you want to use it?
Yeah. Now, along that line, I think you bring up a really interesting way that we could use excuse me, it's easy for me to talk today. You could take modern architectures today, and specifically if you have a cloud-based application where you can turn on a feature to a limited audience and allowing them to feel special about the fact that we're giving you a technology preview. But you can also be very clear that it is not to the full chrome plating. This is 3D printed, non-vacuum form stuff here. This is going to be a little bit rough around the edges, but we really want your opinion on this. That is one way of at least stomping that down. But I guess the further question that I have on this is that to literally just say, no, we're not going to go put this on another list. We're just going to not do anything with it, which is the hardest thing I think in the world for a team to go do, which is we're not going to go explore it. We're not going to go do it. We're not going to invest another dollar of people time into even debating it. Is that something what's the power that you have as a coach to encourage somebody to just drop it?
I think that really falls into the PO role and having really strong POs that are allowed to be POs and are really influential across your organization. If you have someone like that, you have a chance.
Good point. Sheila, what did you have?
I was going to say one of the things that I like to do as a coach when you get business owners and stakeholders who are out there saying, I want all of this. And they think that universe is what makes up that minimum product. And I think at that point, it's important to go through more of a value exercise and what the value is. And one of the things that I like to do in keeping that part simple is using Moscow with everybody and saying, okay, so what is the must-have? Can you do the job without this? And trying to identify those items that are really, you must have this in order to make the product work. Not, this might be something people find useful. Because at that point, when you have the must-haves, then you are going to be in a situation where you can get that rapid feedback of, I really need this particular feature that's not out there. And that may be something that is on your list of should have or your list of could have. And for anybody on the call, Moscow is must have, should have, could have, won't have, and really prioritizing items into those 4 buckets. And that's one of the things that I have done as a coach, especially with teams that are not understanding the notion of that agile principle. It's worked really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've used that before as well. I think, do you find the challenge of something that ends up in the bucket of no, we're not doing it is something, how do you keep it dead? How do you keep it resurrecting?
What I have found is that once you get those must-haves, a lot of what comes next tends to be driven from the feedback versus from your initial ideas. And I've seen this work in a direction that was not the best direction, but in a sense of a long while back when I was managing IT, we had a request from the business group that wanted us to add in all of these different search criteria into one of the pages of the product. And so we did that. We put 7 different ways of searching into this product. But we also did analytics on it. And we found that out of those 7, only the 2 that they thought were the highest priority were the ones that were being used and the others weren't. And it was something that we were able to take and show as a metric about how if we don't do this prioritization exercise, that we can wind up wasting a lot of effort and putting in that additional work that could have been used on more important items. And in that way, what happened is in the future there, or as time went on, that notion was thought about when we went into new features, and we definitely prioritized based on then the specific asks and the needs of the customer afterwards.
Mm.
So do get forgotten.
Right. But again, that's all comes down to very close ties to understanding what the customers are using. And whether it be analytics or a conversation, it becomes very critical in the whole creating a simplicity is that the notion that we have to have those customer contacts. We have to be able to talk to them. And Peter mentioned something about pruning the product tree. And Peter, I just activated your microphone. You're welcome to talk if you want to, but if you can give us a little bit of an insight on what you use, that would be great.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty old practice or technique, the product tree. So it's an exercise where you try to visualize the different features as apples on a tree. And some are on the sunny side, some on the shadow side, some are easy to reach, some are harder to reach. So giving you a metaphor for cost benefit. And then the team exercise to prune that tree So to remove the tricks and apples which are bad or which are not really helpful. And so it's a bit of fun, a bit of gaming, but it also helps the team to build a habit of regularly take a look on their product and prune it like we would prune some things in a garden.
Okay. And in this particular pattern, when you're using this at work, when you say prune, you're actually, I was thinking of this rose bush that I have in my driveway that was scratching the car, literally cutting it off, just removing it from the code base.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. That's pretty good. Have you guys ever did an analysis to say that by doing that, and I'm speaking as a manager now, the efficiency gain that of counting what we didn't do or what we're not going to be doing in the future for an efficiency gain of X or some value cost to that? Because you did mention a cost benefit analysis.
Yeah.
Do you store those up and then say, hey, look, we've saved $1 million this year?
Yeah, so I'm talking about the past. It's some time ago I was involved in that. It was in telecommunications, so developing really large things like a 5G mobile network, thousands of people. And luckily we had some interns or graduates doing some thesis on exactly doing these analyses and looking at code, looking at correlations with all kinds of effects, finding how does complexity correlate with longer analysis, longer detection times for finding root causes. How does it increase cost in terms of we need to maintain tests and documentation for all that stuff that we put into the product, all these kind of things. Yes, at that time, we put quite some effort in it, and that helped us to build the argumentation to continue with that practice because it was really a good business case in doing it.
Cool. Very cool. Thank you for that. Sheila Eckhart, you had an extra comment on this?
I did, because I did something similar, very similar to that, but it wasn't a tree, and we used a Miro board. And so I was consulting, and I had the group go in. There was like a whole bunch of stuff that was in the backlog. There were estimates put on them, and we used those to put values as far as dollars, weighted dollars. And this was the same kind of thing, gamifying what is it that you would spend your money on? So we asked the business that were asking for all of these to put on a business hat to where you had this amount of money and spend it on the features that if you were using this product, what features would you spend your money on? And we had a whole bunch of them do it. And we were able then to see what features had the most spending on it. So that was able to prioritize the backlog for what was going to be done over the course of a quarter. And we did that to make the quarterly planning a lot of fun.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, people are familiar with lean value trees. I like the aspect of that we're betting money. One is the perceived value is a future value of what we think it's going to produce for us if we actually ship it. And it's really interesting that if you place a bet, as the lean value tree says, I'm placing a bet on this feature or this key thing, the question of whether or not the return came in. And that sometimes helps that. But one of the questions I have in this is, we spend a lot of time within business today justifying what we do. And I'm thinking about defensive metrics versus the limits of how many metrics are we going to collect around a certain thing just because, and if you think about it, that's back to my lean hat, that's waste again, because it might help in a decision, but also collecting mountains of data sometimes is not the greatest way to go be simplistic in some regards. How do you monitor that to where it's not going to suddenly you need now 2 people to go maintain that? Does that make sense?
Maintain metrics?
Yeah.
Yeah, this metrics is another interesting topic for me because I feel that sometimes metrics are so incorrectly used, and the wrong metrics are also being used. People aren't looking at the right metrics, and people are looking at metrics too often as a crutch to decision making. So I agree with you. There's a huge balance that has to be made there. And I think the first step of that is understanding each of the metrics and knowing what it tells you and what it doesn't tell you. And I know this is going to sound not really pluggy, but I think that today with some of the AI tools, it's a lot easier to gather the metrics and insights and to be able to put them in and to get some analytics on it. So we do have that advantage right now and going forward to where that won't be as much time wasting as it used to be.
Hmm. And Peter, you made another comment about ring development. Do you want to add some contrast to that?
Yeah, so ring deployment, you meant what I heard you say is what for me came up as ring deployment. So you have concentric rings to which you release features. So you have an inner ring, only 5 people, you deploy to them, get some metrics. If they are positive, you go to the next ring, roll it out to 100 people, 1,000, 10,000, a million, and you only go larger when the evidence is that you should.
Sure. And then in that particular model, if you think of the initial first release that you do for that to that 100 people, would you consider that to be something that's feature complete? Or is that something that is any canary in the coal mine type of operation? Are you trying to minimize customer support cost? Meaning that if I release it and it's got high demand of questions and suddenly I'm now getting inundated in my call center because of the feature that we just released. Is it a balance of both of those, or do you just?
Yeah, I think it is a kind of spectrum. So you could scale the same thing that you had for the inner ring up, rolled out to 1 million people, but that's hardly ever the case. So you do tend to gain insight. That's why we do it. And feedback. And based on that feedback, usually you do make some adjustments.
Okay.
So if you go from ring to an ever wider customer base, there tend to be changes in my experience.
Okay. And again, back to your model of your Apple tree model, do you also use that feedback to then suddenly change your MVP? Does that wrapper back end in your business process?
Yes, the product tree. So it's one thing to do this, to come up with an MVP, and you would test the MVP with a small customer base, so friendly customers or something like that. And based on that, you also start to develop further from the MVP. And at some point, you have a fairly mature product, but the market and the conditions when those features were introduced likely to have changed through the product lifecycle. So it is a good exercise to every now and then think that feature, when we introduced it 2 years ago, was really important to be released, but we see a decline in usage or whatever. And maybe now it's time to take it away.
Okay. That's bold. A lot of companies have a huge challenge with that. I'm also curious, and I see Dr. Talasi on here, and I'm going to unmute his microphone. Security, but security-based architectures and all of that, I can tell you that my hardest part about producing something as a test to go send out to my customers, one of the persons who was always against me was the people in the security department. The saying, I don't know why that is, but if you could, it seems sometimes to be a conflict with doing something simple. Do you agree?
The security practitioners I have seen, like in my current company and previous companies, so they think, some of them, they think that they have a power to guide or stop and no go or go kind of word from them. So it is best to engage these folks in the earlier design phase, not that the security has to start from the earliest stages, day one, and get them consensus from these folks. And so when on the other side of the coin is when most of the companies have the security divisions, a department, just for the namesake, just sitting there, okay, we are doing some security. And if something goes out, something bad happened, we have somebody to blame or go back and say, hey, what did you guys do? So that's why the security folks, sometimes they are very nervous that if for the bad reasons, product publicities on the newspaper, front page, and the other people are going to be the target. There are so many variations of these security things available. Like, for example, NIST organization in the US put out tons of frameworks. Zero Trust is the current thinking of this. How do you secure the whole end-to-end data flow and everything? So basically, don't trust anybody. Keep and validating or keep validating the person who they are or devices who they are. So this has some impact on the whole design. Now, if simplest thing we can do is, let's say the multiple system, like a different subsystem starting from point A and then go to the multiple subsystem and coming out of some results. So how do you contain a bad situation? Say a bad actor get into the system. Can I contain this actor before he do the lateral movement to other system? So I think that is a key important thing, I think, at the moment. So that's why people stop these security guys, look at the design and say, no way this data flow can be stopped if a bad actor is going to this system. They do the threat models and everything, and that reveals, okay, there's no proper security control, so this product is going to be vulnerable out there. And therefore they will stop it.
So I guess that my question of a potential feature not released to everyone yet, per taking out 100 people, trusted actors, that I'm going to go turn on this feature that's not gone through the entire security life cycle of the company. Is that plausible in like the company that you work for right now? Is that capable of actually taking a prototype out without somebody saying, hey, wait a minute, you've got to go do the full penetration-based testing?
That is, as we speak, that kind of engagements are happening with potential customers. So nobody, the rest of the world don't know these features. But first of all, the features need to be acceptable by those customers. So that is happening as we speak in a contained environment. Try the features and see, is it acceptable then before you go to the security? I would say that is one of the good strategies also, like before we spend our security cycles on trying to fix any security hole on what some of the features.
Okay.
I think that's a good point as well. Yeah.
That's awesome. Let's see. Rizzi? Is that Rizzi?
Yes. Hey.
Cool. Hi.
Hey, I just wanted to add something about security. One issue with security people, I'm sorry for generalization, but they've been outside of the software team, especially during the whole Agile movement for the last 20 years. At first, it was like release engineers, then it became DevOps, so they got more into the same. So I've seen a lot of security folks that are thinking more binary. It's either secure or not. Whereas if I'm on a team, like any other feature, security can be prioritized and see how secure I want to be is MVP. So if you're working at a company that is a like financial company like Visa or other ones, like credentials of people are on the stake. So that's high priority. But if you're working in a game industry and was a username and password of someone at the stake, it's a game. Yes, it's not good to have it, but in that first release with a small number of people, it might be fine. And you have other things to think about. So the security folks things like the rest of the team, like a software developer, QA, PO, thinking about the priority and doing the trade-offs, which is software is all about trade-offs. That will solve this. I remember the QA, when the QA and software developers were different, like in different teams, like we have army of software developers and QAs were thinking like that. It's either pass the test or not. Versus now they say, okay, this can go. Let me talk with the PL, see if we can pass over this small bug and then go to the next ones. I think security is the same thing. It's a matter of getting security people more involved and thinking about this. I have one more example. When COVID hit, like we had a 1,000 employee company and I had to help them to go remote, and Miro was a tool to adopt, but the security person and that team was like holding us off for about like 3-4 months for getting Miro in just because of that. That hurt the company a lot. So I got to the CEO and asked him, hey, you need to help us to go push it. It happened after 15 days, but still like we didn't get the full functionality just because they wanted to make sure no IP goes out. There was no new IP coming up because for 2 months, everyone was not using it. I think the trade-off is the main. We need to teach everyone in the company, not only the software development team.
Totally agree with that. I think if it only took you a couple of months, congratulations on that. I could tell you that we tried to go bring in some of those tools and it took us, well, not even close to the near features that we needed, but it took us over a year to get it active. And for whatever reason, for the lack of trust, created a lot of waste within the system as well. Dr. Talasi, you went off mute for a second. What's up?
Oh no, I actually agree with the previous contributors, because also the security thing, I seen it, it's not just a technology, but it's a who is important in this world, job security and other things. So that is also coming to play in this release game. Okay, I'm going to be important person, so I'm not going to be laid off if the workforce reduction is in play, and I'm going to assert my authority here. So it may be for good reason, or also maybe for the survival purposes as well.
I think one of the things that's interesting is that in certain businesses, the ability to repeat and do the product, someone to rip off the design and take it and as a whole, sometimes that's near impossible. And I'll point to the example of just back when I was with Intel Corporation. In order to take that design and actually fabricate it, you need to go build a $10 billion fab. It's even if one IP block got out, it's important and it's critical that we all take the necessary steps. But in early development or early ideation cycles, putting on the full force of the entity, and I think the point of the QA that was just recently mentioned is actually spot on, which is QA used to be not an active participant throughout the entire design. And I even think that the organizational waste that's in there, that's causing us to not have very simplistic designs, is that when management doesn't pay attention to the development, they don't pay attention to what the customers are saying, they don't pay attention to those things, and you spend a lot of time having to catch them up. And I think the corporate mind is currently like in different areas versus we're all in sync about the product that we're trying to go develop, which I think is critical and important. We're approaching the top of the hour. If there's any other last minute comments, I do see one more hand raised. Sheila McGrath, what do you have? What's your last stop?
Yeah, I thought about it, and I think the problem that I run into the most is that within the team, everyone understands Agile. They know what they're doing. But when you go to management and to other departments, they don't. So one of the examples I have is in companies where management has to define objectives and then reach those objectives, and that's how their performance is measured for compensation and promotions and that kind of thing. If you change direction and they had it all quantified based on what they thought they were going to do, that's a problem for them. They have to have a way to adjust their objectives, or it looks like they're failing when they're actually doing something that's good for the company. Mm-hmm. Another thing I've seen in a lot of companies is that they may be held to managing their budget. In some companies, it's as bad to be under budget as it is to be over budget because it's assumed that you were a poor estimator, not that you found some kind of a savings and tried to implement it. So that's something where you need to educate and involve departments that aren't necessarily doing anything directly with Agile in the system sense of it, but that they still need to understand and make allowances for it. Another thing that I've seen is that, and Sheila's example was really good, of the 7 different searches, only 2 of which are actually used. That's pretty common because a lot of times departments will say, I've got them now. Therefore, I'm going to get everything I possibly can because who knows when I'll get them again. And this current hot project, once it's over, we may not ever be able to get them to fix things for us.
Right.
So they try to get everything while they have the access to get it.
Yeah, I fully agree with all of those. Linda, you actually raised your hand real quick. Do you want to get the last insight in?
Sure, I'll go ahead and do that. I was just thinking in terms of the challenges and things that get in your way. And one of the ones I keep running across is we don't have time to think through the solution. So whatever the first thought is for how we're going to accomplish it, that's the one we have to do. And my experience is the first solution just showed you it can be done. Now you need to think it through so you can streamline it, simplify it, make it more intuitive, more straightforward. But so many times I keep seeing that leadership says, okay, we got an answer, go, do it that way. And they never gave you the time to think it through to give you that more simple solution.
Right. I totally agree with that. I think that the notions of, and I think it's this sometimes short-term thinking versus long-term thinking that happens, which is, yeah, that simple decision that go with that idea. And I think to myself as a developer that I'm going to have to maintain that for a very long time. And yeah, and if it's not used, it just becomes this dangling thing in my code base, which I still need to maintain. I appreciate that. I also appreciate your comment also about the company that actually removed a feature because they simply saw it not being used. I think that's another way that we can reach simplicity. So we're approaching the top of the hour. I want to thank everyone for contributing today. It's been great. The comments that have been coming in through the webinar chat and everything else. Great to see that this topic actually got some juices going. New Agility, which is the company that I'm a part of that does this webinar, we've actually opened up 2 online classes that used to be for supporting members, but we want to get more people through this class. So we're opening it up for the summer for free. So one, the guide to upholding Agile principles, which goes through all these 12 principles with lots of practical examples, is out there. That's been in beta, meaning that go ahead and take this class. If you go to newagility.com and give us some feedback on it, because we want to know whether or not this format works. And then the other one that's been out there for a long time with this is the Agile Values and Culture, which is actually a class that walks through the cultural components of Agile and why it works. You're welcome to go take those. They're for free. There's an instructor in the background that can help answer your questions if you have anything that comes up. Really appreciate it. If you guys take a look, newagility.com. Also support our mission, New Agility, as well as support our sponsors, because that's the way that we keep this podcast going. And the sponsors help to pay for webinar costs and all those things. The next live event is going to be Friday, July 26th. Also, if you're new to the Agile Coaching Network, the podcast is if you go to acnpodcast.org, all of the episodes are up there. So you can go listen to some of the prior ones. You can hear when my voice was younger, all of those things. So hopefully wherever the part of the world that you're in, because we are heard in 112 countries, if you're starting your summer, go out, have a great time. And if you're starting your winter season itself, hey, winter is also fun too. Hope you guys all have a great month. And if you want, you can always send us comments and give us feedback. We always welcome those letters to us. So anyway, take care and have a great month. The ACN podcast is for educational and informative use only. If you'd like to know more about the ACN community, please come up to acnpodcast.org and support our show.